The streets of Greenwich Village had a way of slowing down at night, especially in the late 1980s, when the city's constant noise softened into something more distant and rhythmic. Neon signs hummed quietly. Taxis rolled past with tired patience. Apartment windows glowed like small islands of light suspended in the dark. And there, moving without urgency, was a man almost everyone recognized and no one truly saw. He shuffled along the sidewalk in a bathrobe, slippers slapping gently against the concrete, his hair uncombed, his eyes unfocused. Sometimes he muttered to himself. Sometimes he stopped, staring at nothing in particular. To the casual observer, he was just another troubled soul wandering New York streets, a harmless eccentric folded into the background of a restless city. But this man was Vincent Chin Gigante, and while the city slept around him, he was awake in ways few could imagine. For years, neighbors had grown used to the sight. Shop owners nodded politely. Police officers glanced, shrugged, and moved on. He was known as Chin, a man with obvious mental problems, someone best left alone. In a city filled with spectacle, madness was not unusual, and Chin Gigante blended into that accepted chaos perfectly. The genius of it lay not in disappearance, but in overexposure. He did not hide in shadows or behind locked doors. He walked in plain sight, daily and deliberately, until his presence became invisible. What almost no one understood was that this wandering figure was, at that very moment, the most powerful mafia boss in America. While other crime leaders dressed sharply and courted headlines, Gigante chose obscurity. While prosecutors chased loud targets who craved attention, he cultivated an image so unthreatening it bordered on absurd. The bathrobe was not a joke. It was armor. The vacant stare was not confusion. It was strategy. Each step he took down those quiet streets reinforced a lie so consistent that it hardened into truth for anyone watching. In the world of organized crime, where power often announces itself through fear and violence, Gigante ruled through silence. He rarely raised his voice. He avoided public gatherings. He never sought credit. Orders traveled through layers of trusted intermediaries, whispered and repeated until they arrived without fingerprints. Entire criminal enterprises moved at his discretion, yet his name was rarely spoken aloud. Even among his own people, he remained distant, myth-like, more concept than man. Law enforcement knew of him, of course. They had known for decades. Files existed, thick with surveillance notes and informant rumors. But knowledge is not proof, and proof was something Gigante understood deeply. The image he projected made prosecution nearly impossible. How do you put a man on trial who appears incapable of understanding where he is? How do you convince a jury that a disheveled figure muttering on a street corner is secretly orchestrating murder, extortion, and billion-dollar rackets? The answer, for many years, was that you don't. You wait. And while the government waited, Gigante ruled. The calm of his nightly walks was deceptive. Beneath that surface drifted calculations refined over decades. He had learned early that the greatest danger did not come from enemies, but from attention. Attention led to ego. Ego led to mistakes. Mistakes led to prison, or worse. Gigante watched others fall, watched empires collapse under the weight of arrogance, and he adjusted accordingly. Where others shouted, he whispered. Where others strutted, he shuffled. New York in that era was a city of contrasts. Towering wealth existed alongside quiet desperation. Power flowed invisibly through back rooms and social clubs, while ordinary people passed through unaware. Gigante understood that environment instinctively. He became part of the city's texture, as familiar and unremarkable as cracked pavement or flickering streetlights. His genius was not brutality, though he was capable of it. His genius was patience. There is something almost unsettling about how long the illusion held. Psychiatrists examined him. Judges observed him. Officers watched him pace hospital corridors and courthouse hallways, mumbling incoherently, seemingly lost inside his own mind. The performance never slipped. Not once in public did he betray awareness. Not once did he correct someone or show irritation at being underestimated. Underestimation, he knew, was freedom. At night, as the city exhaled and windows darkened one by one, Gigante's power continued its quiet circulation. Construction deals were approved. Territory disputes were resolved. Debts were collected. Lives were spared or ended, all without his name ever appearing on paper. The man in the bathrobe was everywhere and nowhere, an open secret wrapped in denial. This story is not loud. It does not open with gunfire or flashing police lights. It begins with footsteps on concrete and a city that chose not to look too closely. It begins with a question that feels almost too simple. How could someone so visible remain untouchable for so long? To answer that, we must move backward, away from the calm streets of Greenwich Village and into the harder landscapes that shaped Vincent Gigante long before the bathrobe, long before the whispers. We must understand the boy who learned early that strength did not always announce itself, that survival often depended on stillness. The man who would one day convince the world he was broken had spent a lifetime assembling himself with careful precision. As the city settles into sleep, and the image of that wandering figure fades into darkness, the truth lingers quietly beneath the surface. Power does not always look powerful. Sometimes it looks confused, harmless, and forgotten. Sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one everyone has stopped noticing. The Bronx in the early 20th century was a place of constant motion, even when it appeared still. Brick apartment buildings pressed tightly against one another, their fire escapes hanging like skeletal ladders over narrow streets. The air carried the mixed smells of bread from corner bakeries, coal smoke from furnaces, and damp concrete after rain. Immigrant families crowded into small apartments, bringing with them old-world customs and new-world anxieties. It was here, in 1928, that Vincent Gigante was born, entering a world where survival depended on adaptability, restraint, and an unspoken understanding of power. His family lived modestly, like most others in the neighborhood. There was no glamour in those early years, no sign that the boy would one day command vast criminal networks. His father worked hard, his mother kept order at home, and the rhythms of daily life were defined by school bells, church services, and the steady hum of city life outside their windows. Discipline was not an abstract idea, it was enforced through routine, expectation, and the quiet pressure to endure without complaint. From an early age, Vincent learned that showing too much emotion, fear, excitement, anger, often brought consequences. The streets outside offered their own education. Children played stickball between parked cars, dodging traffic and shouting warnings. Older boys gathered on corners, leaning against brick walls, watching who came and went. These were the unofficial gatekeepers of the neighborhood, and Vincent noticed them. He noticed how they spoke softly but were obeyed quickly. How people made way for them without being asked. Authority, he observed, did not always need volume. Violence, too, was present, though rarely discussed openly. Fights broke out and disappeared just as quickly. Men nursed bruises without explanation. Arguments ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned. For a boy paying attention, patterns emerged. Power operated beneath the surface, guided by rules that were never written down. Vincent absorbed these lessons quietly, storing them away without commentary. School did not captivate him. Like many children of the era, he found formal education disconnected from the realities of his environment. What mattered more was reputation, how you carried yourself, whether you could be trusted, whether you could remain silent. Silence, in particular, became a form of currency. Speaking too much could invite trouble. Asking the wrong questions could mark you as careless. Vincent learned to listen, to watch, and to wait. As he grew older, the neighborhood's influence deepened. The Great Depression had left its scars, and even as the economy slowly recovered, opportunities remained limited. Some men worked honest jobs that barely sustained their families. Others found faster ways to earn respect and money. The difference between the two paths was often a matter of chance, timing, and who noticed you first. Vincent noticed both paths, but he seemed drawn to the spaces between them, the quiet moments where decisions were made without announcement. Religion played a subtle role in his upbringing. Church offered structure, ritual, and the idea of confession, but it also reinforced the concept that appearances mattered. People dressed neatly on Sundays, spoke kindly, and presented their best selves, regardless of what happened during the week. This duality, public virtue, private reality, left an impression. It suggested that identity could be shaped, adjusted, even performed. By his teenage years, Vincent had developed a reserved demeanor. He was not the loudest or most aggressive among his peers, but he carried himself with a calm that others seemed to respect. He did not rush into conflict, nor did he retreat from it. Instead, he measured situations carefully, responding only when necessary. This balance made him noticeable to the right people. The Bronx at night was a different world. Streetlights cast long shadows, and conversations lowered in volume. It was during these hours that informal networks came alive. Men stood together not out of idleness, but vigilance. Information traveled in fragments, passed through gestures and brief exchanges. Vincent began to understand that knowledge itself was a form of leverage. Knowing who controlled which block, which businesses paid protection, which disputes were unresolved, these details mattered. Family expectations weighed quietly on him. There was an understanding that loyalty began at home and extended outward. Betrayal was not tolerated, and neither was weakness. Yet there was also an unspoken acknowledgement that survival sometimes required flexibility. Rules existed, but they could bend under the right circumstances. Vincent learned to recognize those circumstances. As the city moved toward the post-war era, opportunities for young men like Vincent expanded in subtle ways. Organized crime had become more structured, more deliberate. It was no longer just about brute force, it was about organization, discretion, and long-term planning. The men who succeeded were those who could remain composed under pressure, who understood when to act and when to remain still. These qualities aligned naturally with Vincent's temperament. He did not announce his ambitions, perhaps because he did not yet fully understand them himself. What he did understand was that visibility carried risk. Those who drew attention often paid for it. Those who stayed in the background endured. This belief, formed long before the bathrobe and the wandering act, became foundational. It shaped how he evaluated every opportunity, every relationship, every risk. By the time Vincent Gigante stepped fully into the adult world, he had already mastered something rare, the ability to be present without being exposed. The Bronx had taught him that power was not always loud, that strength could exist in restraint, and that the most effective moves were often the ones no one noticed. These early lessons, etched into him by crowded streets and quiet observations, would guide him far beyond the neighborhood that raised him. And as he left those familiar blocks behind, carrying with him the habits of silence and patience, the path ahead did not yet reveal its full shape. But the foundations were set. The boy from the Bronx had learned how to disappear without leaving, how to listen more than speak, and how to wait for the moment when waiting itself became power. By the time Vincent Gigante reached his late teens and early 20s, the streets that had shaped him no longer felt like a classroom. They felt like a proving ground. The Bronx had hardened him, but it had also taught him restraint, and now that balance began to express itself through physical discipline. Boxing entered his life not as a dream of fame, but as a way to channel pressure. Gyms were dim, airless spaces filled with the dull thud of gloves against flesh and the sharp scent of sweat and liniment. Here, pain was expected, even welcomed. It arrived cleanly, honestly, without deception. Gigante showed promise. He was strong, compact, and surprisingly patient in the ring. He did not rush opponents or waste energy. He absorbed punishment without visible frustration, waiting for openings rather than forcing them. Trainers noticed his calm. Other fighters noticed it too. There was something unsettling about a man who did not react when struck, who neither smiled nor snarled, but simply adjusted and continued. Boxing taught Vincent how to control his breathing, how to conserve strength, how to endure discomfort without revealing weakness. These lessons extended far beyond sport. The discipline of training appealed to him. Early mornings, repetitive drills, the steady rhythm of preparation. Unlike the chaos of street fights, boxing operated under rules, even if they were occasionally bent. But beneath those rules lay something darker. Fighters were often connected to gamblers, promoters, and men who spoke softly but carried authority. Money changed hands quietly. Matches were arranged. Outcomes were sometimes influenced. Vincent noticed this intersection immediately. Violence, when organized, became profitable. As his involvement in boxing deepened, so did his exposure to a different kind of world. After fights, conversations drifted away from sports and toward opportunities. Favors were discussed obliquely. Names were dropped carefully. Vincent listened more than he spoke, absorbing the unspoken language of organized crime. He learned which men mattered and which ones simply wanted to appear important. He learned who watched from a distance and who tested loyalty through small requests. The physicality of boxing also reinforced a truth he already sensed: fear could be managed. Pain could be endured. What mattered was composure. In moments of pressure, most people revealed themselves. Some panicked. Some overreacted. Vincent did neither. This quality made him useful beyond the ring. When minor disputes arose, arguments over territory, money, or respect, his presence alone often diffused situations. He did not threaten. He stood quietly, letting silence do the work. Gradually, his reputation shifted. He was no longer just a boxer or a neighborhood tough. He became someone who could be relied upon. Someone who did not talk to the police. Someone who understood boundaries. Small tasks came first. Delivering messages. Standing watch. Making sure a meeting remained uninterrupted. Each task was a test, and each test was passed without drama. Violence, when it came, was precise. Vincent did not enjoy it, but he did not avoid it either. He approached it the way he approached boxing, as a requirement, not an indulgence. When fights broke out, they ended quickly. When intimidation was necessary, it was controlled. He never lingered, never celebrated. This detachment distinguished him from others who sought validation through brutality. To Vincent, violence was simply another tool, to be used sparingly and correctly. The underworld took notice. Men connected to larger criminal structures began to observe him from a distance. They saw a young man who did not draw attention, who followed instructions exactly, and who never spoke out of turn. In an environment where informants and impulsive behavior posed constant threats, these traits were invaluable. Vincent did not seek advancement, but advancement found him nonetheless. At the same time, boxing continued to refine his understanding of performance. In the ring, perception mattered as much as reality. A fighter could appear hurt without being finished, could feign weakness to lure an opponent into a mistake. Vincent learned how easily appearances misled. He learned how to project vulnerability without surrendering control. These lessons would later define his life, though he could not yet see how fully. Outside the gym, the streets remained unforgiving. Arrests were common. Some men vanished into prison. Others disappeared entirely. Vincent watched these outcomes closely. He noticed patterns. Those who talked too much, those who flaunted success, those who underestimated law enforcement, they were the ones who fell. Survival favored the cautious. Power favored the invisible. As his early 20s progressed, Vincent's connections deepened. He began working more regularly with men tied to organized crime families, though affiliations were never stated outright. The structure of the mafia was not something you joined through paperwork. It was something you were slowly absorbed into, through trust and repetition. Each successful task tightened the bond. Each moment of restraint reinforced confidence. The world he was entering valued loyalty above all else. Betrayal was remembered longer than any favor. Vincent understood this instinctively. He did not gossip. He did not speculate. He accepted instructions without questioning motives. This made him predictable, and predictability bred trust. In time, trust opened doors that force never could. Yet for all his growing involvement, Vincent remained reserved. He lived modestly. He avoided unnecessary attention. He did not indulge in excess or display wealth. This restraint puzzled some, but reassured others. It suggested long-term thinking. It suggested a man who was not in a hurry. Boxing, eventually, faded from the center of his life, but its lessons never left him. The ring had taught him timing. It had taught him endurance. Most importantly, it had taught him how to take a hit without revealing pain. In the criminal world, this skill translated seamlessly. Pressure came in different forms: interrogations, threats, temptation, but the response remained the same: calm, controlled, silent. By the time Vincent Gigante fully transitioned away from the gym and deeper into organized crime, he was already something more than a common enforcer. He was a study in restraint. A man shaped by discipline rather than impulse. Those who worked with him sensed it, even if they could not articulate it. He did not need to announce himself. His presence was enough. The foundation had been laid. The boy from the Bronx had become a man who understood both violence and its limits. He had learned how to stand still while others exhausted themselves. How to wait while others rushed. And as the criminal world quietly opened its doors to him, Vincent Gigante stepped through without fanfare, already preparing for a life where the most important battles would be fought not with fists, but with patience. By the time Vincent Gigante began moving closer to the inner circles of organized crime, the world he entered was governed by rules far more subtle than anything he had known on the streets or in the boxing ring. This was not a realm of constant violence or loud declarations of power. It was a system built on tradition, hierarchy, and above all, discretion. At its center stood the Genovese crime family, an organization that valued invisibility as much as dominance. For a man like Gigante, shaped by patience and restraint, it was an environment where his instincts aligned perfectly with expectation. The Genovese family operated differently from its rivals. While other mafia groups cultivated reputations through public displays and flamboyant leaders, the Genovese preferred to fade into the background. Their power was real, but it was quiet. Decisions were made behind closed doors, names were rarely spoken aloud, and leadership was often obscured even from those working within the system. This culture of secrecy was not accidental. It was survival strategy refined over decades. Gigante entered this world cautiously. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no formal welcome. Instead, there were conversations held in low voices, meetings arranged indirectly, and instructions delivered through trusted intermediaries. Each interaction served as a test. Would he speak when silence was expected? Would he question authority? Would he draw attention to himself? Each time, Gigante responded correctly, not because he was coached, but because he already understood the value of restraint. Men higher up in the family began to notice his consistency. In a world where ego often undermined ambition, Gigante showed none. He did not attempt to impress. He did not rush to demonstrate loyalty through unnecessary violence. When asked to act, he acted efficiently. When asked to wait, he waited without complaint. This reliability made him useful, and usefulness, in the mafia, was the foundation of advancement. The Genovese philosophy emphasized long-term thinking. Short-term gains meant little if they attracted unwanted attention. This approach required discipline from everyone involved, from street-level associates to those quietly directing operations. Gigante absorbed this mindset effortlessly. He had already learned that survival depended on blending in, on becoming unremarkable. Within the family, this translated into a role that was intentionally undefined. He was not pushed into visibility. He was placed where discretion mattered most. As he spent more time within the Genovese orbit, Gigante observed how power truly flowed. It was not centralized in a single figure who commanded through fear alone. Instead, authority moved through networks of trust. Messages passed through layers, each one designed to insulate those at the top. This structure frustrated law enforcement, but it also required absolute discipline from those within it. One careless word could unravel years of careful planning. Gigante rarely spoke during meetings. When he did, his words were measured and direct. He did not speculate or offer opinions unless asked. This behavior contrasted sharply with others who sought to assert themselves through conversation. Over time, his silence became a signal of reliability. It suggested that he understood more than he said. That understanding made him valuable. The family's leaders recognized something else in him as well: adaptability. Gigante could move between worlds without leaving traces. He could sit quietly in a social club one day and walk unnoticed through a crowded street the next. He did not carry himself like someone seeking recognition. He looked like someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. This ability to disappear into the background was rare, and it aligned perfectly with the Genovese emphasis on invisibility. Trust within the family was built slowly. Tests were subtle. Sometimes they involved information, how it was handled, whether it traveled further than intended. Sometimes they involved patience, how long someone could wait without asking questions. Gigante passed these tests not through effort, but through instinct. He did not feel entitled to knowledge or status. He understood that access was earned, not demanded. As the years passed, his role expanded quietly. He became a conduit, someone through whom decisions could pass without distortion. This required emotional control. He did not allow personal feelings to interfere with instructions. He did not take sides in internal disputes unless directed. This neutrality protected him and strengthened his position. In a world driven by alliances and rivalries, being perceived as steady and impartial was a powerful advantage. The Genovese family's structure also taught Gigante the importance of plausible deniability. Leaders insulated themselves through layers of separation. Front bosses absorbed public attention while real authority remained hidden. This concept resonated deeply with him. It mirrored lessons he had already learned from observing street power and boxing strategy. Appearances misled. Reality operated beneath the surface. Gradually, Gigante's proximity to decision-making increased. He was trusted with sensitive matters, with tasks that required judgment rather than force. This shift marked a transition from utility to influence. Yet even as his importance grew, his visibility did not. He remained deliberately understated, avoiding patterns that could be traced. The environment reinforced his belief that the most dangerous mistakes came from arrogance. He watched others falter, drawing attention through excess or impatience. Some were removed quietly. Others were allowed to destroy themselves. The lesson was clear: longevity required humility, even if it was only performed. By the time Gigante was firmly embedded within the Genovese structure, he had learned its most important lesson. Power did not need to be acknowledged to exist. In fact, acknowledgement often weakened it. The family thrived because it resisted the temptation to be seen, and Gigante thrived because he embodied that philosophy completely. This period of quiet integration shaped the man he would become. It refined his instincts, sharpened his patience, and confirmed his belief that control was most effective when it was invisible. The Genovese family did not merely give Vincent Gigante opportunity. It gave him a framework in which his natural tendencies could evolve into something far more formidable. And as his influence continued to grow beneath layers of silence, few could have predicted how far this approach would carry him. But the foundations were firmly in place. The rules had been learned. The game had been understood. All that remained was time. By the late 1950s, the world Vincent Gigante moved through had narrowed and sharpened. The quiet observations of his youth and the discipline of boxing had prepared him for this moment, though he could not have known it at the time. Loyalty was no longer an abstract expectation. It was about to be tested in the most permanent way possible. Within the mafia, there were moments that defined a man forever, moments when hesitation was remembered longer than action. One such moment arrived in 1957, and it would bind Gigante to the underworld in blood. At the center of the storm was Frank Costello, a powerful and respected mafia boss whose influence extended far beyond New York streets. Costello was not a loud man. He did not seek violence unnecessarily. He operated through politics, connections, and a calm authority that made him difficult to challenge. But power, even when subtle, invites rivals. Vito Genovese, ambitious and resentful, wanted Costello removed. The order was simple in concept, devastating in implication. Costello had to die. For such an assignment, Genovese needed someone reliable, someone who would not panic, someone who would not talk. Vincent Gigante fit the profile. He was not chosen because he was famous or feared. He was chosen because he was quiet. Because he followed instructions. Because he understood that certain tasks existed beyond personal morality. When the directive reached him, there was no recorded reaction. No protest. No hesitation. Acceptance, in this world, was expected to be silent. The night of the attempt unfolded without spectacle. There were no dramatic confrontations, no extended planning sessions filled with speeches. Gigante waited. When the moment arrived, he approached Costello in the lobby of his apartment building. The space was enclosed, dimly lit, ordinary. That ordinariness made it more dangerous. History often unfolds in places that look unremarkable. Gigante fired the gun. The shot echoed briefly, then dissolved into chaos. Costello collapsed, wounded but alive. In a twist of fate that would ripple outward for decades, the bullet failed to kill him. Gigante fled, disappearing into the night, carrying with him the weight of what he had done and what he had failed to do. For most men, failure in such a task would mean death. The mafia did not forgive mistakes lightly, especially when they involved high-profile targets. Yet the aftermath unfolded differently. Costello survived and, remarkably, chose not to identify Gigante as his attacker. Whether this was an act of mercy, pragmatism, or exhaustion remains a subject of speculation. What mattered was the result. Gigante lived. He was arrested soon after, charged with attempted murder. The legal process moved forward, slow and methodical. In court, Gigante did not dramatize himself. He did not proclaim innocence loudly or attempt to shift blame. He remained restrained, distant. This demeanor, consistent with everything that had come before, worked in his favor. Witnesses were limited. Evidence was incomplete. He was convicted of a lesser charge and sentenced to prison, not death. Within the underworld, interpretations of the event varied. Some viewed the failed hit as incompetence. Others understood the deeper reality. Gigante had accepted an impossible assignment and carried it out as instructed. The fact that Costello survived was not entirely within his control. More importantly, he had not spoken. He had not implicated others. He had absorbed the consequences quietly. This silence mattered more than success. In the mafia, loyalty was measured not by outcomes, but by behavior under pressure. Gigante had demonstrated that when faced with the highest stakes, he remained contained. He did not unravel. He did not bargain. He endured. Prison, once again, became a classroom. But this time, the lessons were heavier. He saw firsthand how the system treated those who panicked, those who talked, those who tried to save themselves by offering information. Their reputations disintegrated quickly. Some were ostracized. Others were marked for worse fates upon release. Gigante observed, listened, and said nothing. The attempted murder of Frank Costello marked a turning point. It elevated Gigante's standing within the Genovese family, paradoxical as that may seem. He had proven himself willing to act at the highest level. He had demonstrated restraint in failure. And he had accepted punishment without complaint. These qualities resonated deeply with leaders who valued predictability and control. When Gigante was released from prison, he did not emerge as a celebrated figure. There were no congratulatory gestures, no public acknowledgments. Instead, his reintegration was quiet. Doors that had once been only slightly open now opened a little wider. Conversations shifted subtly. Trust deepened. He did not speak of the shooting. Not publicly. Not privately. It became one of those events that existed in silence, acknowledged only through changed behavior. Others deferred to him more readily. Instructions carried greater weight when delivered through him. His presence implied history, commitment, and reliability. The experience also reinforced a lesson that would define his entire career. Violence drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny led to consequences. Even when violence was necessary, it was best handled quietly, indirectly, and without flourish. The shooting had been loud in the literal sense, but Gigante ensured that its aftermath was subdued. Psychologically, the event hardened him. Not in the sense of cruelty, but in acceptance. He understood now that certain lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. There was no returning to anonymity. Only a deeper immersion into the structures that offered protection through secrecy. It is tempting to view this moment as the birth of a ruthless criminal, but that oversimplifies the reality. Gigante did not become reckless or brutal. He became cautious. More measured. More aware of the cost of visibility. The lesson was not that violence solved problems, but that even necessary violence created complications. Years later, when he would famously feign madness to avoid prosecution, echoes of this early experience would remain. He had seen how the system reacted to clear threats. He had felt the pressure of legal scrutiny. He had survived by remaining silent and controlled. These strategies did not emerge suddenly. They were forged in moments like this one. The attempted killing of Frank Costello did not end Costello's life, but it ended an era. Costello stepped back from power soon after, effectively granting Vito Genovese the dominance he sought. In this sense, the mission succeeded, even if the method failed. Gigante's role in that transition, though rarely highlighted, was significant. As time moved forward, the memory of that night faded into the background, but its impact lingered. It had bound Vincent Gigante irrevocably to the highest levels of organized crime. It had proven his loyalty in the most convincing way possible. And it had taught him that survival depended not on force alone, but on control, silence, and the careful management of appearances. The man who would later wander New York streets in a bathrobe had once stood in a quiet lobby, gun in hand, executing an order without emotion. That contrast is not accidental. It is the thread that runs through his entire life. Power exercised without display. Commitment proven without words. And a willingness to disappear behind whatever mask was necessary to endure. Prison has a way of stripping life down to its most basic rhythms. Days are measured by counts, meals, and the echo of doors opening and closing. For Vincent Gigante, incarceration was not unfamiliar territory by the time he entered it again after the Costello shooting. Yet this period carried a different weight. He was no longer just another offender passing through the system. He was a man whose loyalty had been tested at the highest level, and whose future depended entirely on how he conducted himself while confined. From the moment he arrived, Gigante understood the unspoken rules. Prison rewarded patience and punished impatience. Men who talked too much attracted attention. Men who complained attracted trouble. Those who survived longest were the ones who blended in, who observed more than they spoke. This environment suited him. He did not need to reinvent himself. He simply continued the habits he had already cultivated. Inside, information circulated constantly. Rumors moved faster than official announcements. Alliances formed and dissolved with subtle shifts in power. Gigante paid attention, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Knowledge in prison could keep a man alive, but only if handled correctly. Sharing it recklessly was dangerous. Hoarding it invited suspicion. The balance lay in quiet awareness. He avoided unnecessary confrontations. When disputes arose, he did not rush to assert dominance. Instead, he let tensions resolve themselves whenever possible. This approach was not weakness. It was strategy. In prison, every conflict carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Gigante understood that winning a fight could mean losing months or years of relative stability. His reputation followed him, though it was never discussed openly. Men knew why he was there. They knew what it implied. This knowledge created a buffer around him. He did not need to threaten anyone. The understanding of his past actions, combined with his calm demeanor, discouraged provocation. Those who sought drama looked elsewhere. Time in prison allowed him to refine a skill that would later define his leadership: waiting. Waiting without impatience. Waiting without visible frustration. Waiting while others exhausted themselves with ambition or fear. He watched men unravel under the pressure of confinement, watched them make impulsive decisions that destroyed what remained of their futures. Each observation reinforced his belief that endurance was power. He also saw how the justice system functioned from the inside. The routines, the negotiations, the quiet bargains struck between inmates and authorities. Some men tried to leverage information for leniency. Others held out, hoping loyalty would be rewarded later. Gigante took note of both paths. He did not judge them, but he learned from them. The consequences were clear. Those who cooperated lived under a different kind of sentence, one that extended beyond prison walls. Those who remained silent often faced longer terms, but retained something intangible and invaluable: trust. Trust, in his world, was not an abstract concept. It was currency. It determined who would be protected, who would be promoted, who would be remembered. Gigante knew that every word spoken in prison could echo for years. Silence, therefore, became his shield. There were moments of boredom, long stretches where days blurred together. During these times, he reflected on what had brought him there. Not with regret, but with analysis. He replayed decisions, not to second-guess them, but to understand their mechanics. This analytical mindset distinguished him from many around him. He was not consumed by emotion. He was preparing for what came next. The environment also exposed him to men from different criminal backgrounds. Each carried their own methods, their own philosophies. Some were impulsive, driven by pride. Others were calculating, always seeking advantage. Gigante observed how these traits played out over time. Impulsiveness led to isolation. Calculation, when paired with patience, led to survival. These observations confirmed what he had long suspected. When conversations turned to life outside, Gigante listened carefully. He paid attention to shifts in power, to rumors about leadership changes, to the rise and fall of figures he recognized. Prison did not isolate him from the world entirely. It filtered information, distilling it into fragments that required interpretation. He became adept at reading between the lines, at understanding what was not being said. His own standing outside continued to solidify quietly. The fact that he had taken the fall without implicating others was noted. The fact that he maintained discipline inside reinforced his reputation. In a system where loyalty was rare and fear common, his behavior stood out. Prison also reinforced the importance of appearance. Guards, like anyone else, made judgments based on demeanor. Inmates who appeared volatile were treated differently from those who appeared compliant. Gigante learned to project neutrality. He followed rules when it served him. He did not challenge authority unnecessarily. This approach reduced scrutiny and allowed him to move through his sentence with minimal disruption. When his release finally approached, it did not come with celebration. There were no expectations of immediate reward. That was not how his world operated. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that his conduct had been noted, that his silence had value. He emerged from prison not hardened in the stereotypical sense, but sharpened. His instincts were validated. His patience had paid off. Re-entry into the outside world required adjustment, but Gigante handled it with the same restraint he had shown inside. He did not rush to reassert himself. He observed, reacclimated, and waited. This waiting was not passive. It was deliberate. He needed to understand how the landscape had shifted during his absence. The lessons of prison stayed with him. He carried them into every interaction, every decision. He understood more clearly than ever that time was a weapon. That endurance outlasted force. That silence, maintained consistently, could shape outcomes more effectively than any display of power. Years later, when observers would marvel at his ability to evade prosecution through elaborate performances, few would consider how much of that strategy was born in places like this. In cells and corridors, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by men who broke under pressure, Vincent Gigante learned how to remain intact. Prison did not change him. It confirmed him. It reinforced the principles that would guide him through decades of leadership. Stay quiet. Stay patient. Let others reveal themselves. And above all, understand that the long game belongs to those who can endure without being seen. When he walked free, the world saw nothing remarkable. Just another man released from custody, returning to ordinary life. But beneath that unremarkable surface, something had solidified. A mindset honed by confinement. A commitment to discretion strengthened by observation. And a readiness to move forward, not loudly, but with deliberate, quiet intent. When Vincent Gigante returned fully to the world he had left behind, he stepped into an organization that had perfected the art of operating without a visible center. The Genovese crime family was not built around a single, charismatic figure. It was structured like a system, layered and compartmentalized, designed to endure even when individual parts were removed. This was not accidental. It was the product of decades spent watching rivals rise quickly and fall just as fast. Power, the Genovese believed, should never be obvious. Unlike other mafia families that openly celebrated their bosses, the Genovese preferred ambiguity. Leadership existed, but it was often obscured behind titles that meant little to outsiders. Front bosses absorbed public attention, acting as lightning rods for law enforcement and media. Behind them, decision-making continued quietly, insulated by distance and deniability. This structure frustrated investigators and protected those who truly mattered. It also demanded discipline from everyone involved. Gigante understood this philosophy instinctively. He did not need it explained. His own experiences had taught him that visibility invited danger. Within the family, this belief translated into a culture where discretion was rewarded and ego was a liability. Men who sought recognition were viewed with suspicion. Men who blended in were trusted. The family's hierarchy was rigid but subtle. Orders flowed downward through intermediaries, rarely originating from a single, identifiable source. Each layer existed to absorb risk. If one person fell, others remained untouched. Communication was indirect, coded, and often redundant, ensuring that no single failure could compromise the whole. This system required patience and cooperation. It also required leaders who were comfortable relinquishing public acknowledgement of their authority. Gigante fit this requirement perfectly. As his influence grew, it did so without ceremony. He was not announced. He was not celebrated. Instead, he became a point of reference, someone others deferred to without explanation. His authority was understood rather than declared. Meetings within the family were quiet affairs. There were no speeches or dramatic gestures. Discussions were brief and focused. Decisions were made with an eye toward long-term stability rather than immediate gain. Gigante participated sparingly, offering input only when necessary. This restraint reinforced his credibility. It suggested that when he did speak, his words mattered. The concept of a family without a face extended beyond leadership. Even street-level operations were designed to avoid patterns. Businesses were used as fronts, but they were ordinary, unremarkable places that did not attract attention. Money flowed through legitimate channels whenever possible, blurring the line between legal and illegal activity. This approach reduced exposure and complicated prosecution. Gigante observed how effectively this system functioned. He saw how rival families struggled with internal conflict and law enforcement pressure, while the Genovese endured. The absence of a visible boss created confusion among enemies and investigators alike. It also created space for real leaders to operate without interference. Trust was the foundation of this structure. Without direct communication, the system relied on confidence in intermediaries. Betrayal at any level could destabilize the entire organization. For this reason, loyalty was tested constantly, though rarely openly. Small assignments served as indicators. How information was handled mattered more than results. Silence was valued above success. Gigante excelled in this environment. He did not seek to control every detail. He trusted the structure to function as designed. When intervention was necessary, it was subtle. Corrections were made quietly, without punishment or spectacle. This approach maintained stability and minimized resentment. The absence of a visible leader also altered the psychology of those within the family. Without a single figure to blame or challenge, authority became diffuse. This diffusion reduced the likelihood of rebellion and concentrated ambition. Advancement depended not on ambition alone, but on alignment with the family's values. Gigante embodied those values so completely that his influence felt natural. As time passed, his role evolved. He became a stabilizing force, someone whose presence reassured others. Decisions associated with him carried weight even when his involvement was indirect. This kind of influence was difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. Law enforcement struggled to adapt. Traditional strategies relied on identifying leaders and building cases around them. The Genovese model undermined this approach. Without a clear target, investigations stalled. Informants offered fragments, but these fragments rarely connected to a central figure. Gigante's name surfaced occasionally, but always at a distance, always without clarity. Within the family, this ambiguity was intentional. Leaders remained flexible, adjusting roles as needed to maintain balance. Gigante understood that formal titles were less important than functional authority. He did not need to be recognized as boss to act like one. This period marked a transition from participation to stewardship. Gigante was no longer simply operating within the system. He was helping to preserve it. His decisions reflected an understanding that survival required continuity. Disruption, even in pursuit of profit, was dangerous. The family's operations continued to generate wealth quietly. Construction, labor unions, gambling, and other enterprises functioned with minimal interference. This success reinforced confidence in the system. It also validated Gigante's belief that power was most effective when it was least visible. Over time, the idea of a family without a face became synonymous with the Genovese. And within that faceless structure, Gigante's presence became central. He was not the only influence, but he was a consistent one. His approach shaped the family's behavior, even when his name was not mentioned. This anonymity protected him. It allowed him to observe, to adjust, to wait. It also prepared him for what would come next. As law enforcement intensified its efforts and public scrutiny increased, the Genovese model, and Gigante's role within it, would be tested. For now, however, the system held. The family moved quietly through the city, woven into its fabric. And at its center, unseen and unacknowledged, Vincent Gigante continued to refine the art of invisible power. By the time the 1970s gave way to the early 1980s, Vincent Gigante's position within the Genovese family had shifted from influence to quiet command. There was no announcement to mark the change, no moment that could be pointed to as the beginning of his rule. Instead, authority accumulated around him gradually, like gravity forming around a massive but unseen object. Decisions increasingly traced back to his approval, even if his name never appeared in the conversation. The structure of the family made this possible. Official titles remained fluid, almost symbolic. Front bosses absorbed attention and legal pressure, while the real center of control stayed deliberately obscured. Gigante understood this arrangement better than anyone. He did not seek formal recognition. He understood that being recognized was often the first step toward being targeted. Those who interacted with him sensed the shift. Conversations became more careful. Instructions carried more weight when they passed through channels associated with him. Disputes were brought to him indirectly, not because he demanded it, but because his judgment was trusted. He listened, absorbed information, and responded with minimal guidance. Often, his response took the form of a single sentence or even a gesture. That was enough. This style of leadership required immense discipline from those around him. Without overt displays of authority, obedience depended on respect and consistency. Gigante maintained both. He did not contradict himself. He did not act impulsively. When he gave direction, it was measured and final. Over time, this predictability created stability. Men knew where they stood, even if the structure was never explained to them explicitly. The contrast between Gigante and other mafia bosses of the era was striking. While figures like John Gotti embraced publicity, dressing sharply and courting the media, Gigante did the opposite. He avoided cameras. He dressed plainly. He limited his movements. This contrast was not accidental. Gigante had watched how attention destroyed others. He had seen how ego invited scrutiny. His approach was designed to outlast trends, not dominate headlines. Power, for Gigante, was not about intimidation alone. It was about control. Control of information. Control of tempo. Control of perception. He allowed others to believe they were autonomous, while quietly shaping outcomes behind the scenes. This created an illusion of decentralization that further protected him. The family's operations flourished under this model. Revenue streams continued uninterrupted. Conflicts were resolved before they escalated. Law enforcement pressure was diffused across multiple fronts, preventing any single case from gaining momentum. Gigante's leadership was not dramatic, but it was effective. Those closest to him understood the importance of insulation. Messages were passed carefully. Meetings were limited. Physical proximity to Gigante was rare and purposeful. This distance was not personal. It was strategic. The fewer connections that could be traced, the safer everyone remained. Gigante also demonstrated an acute understanding of human psychology. He allowed ambitious men enough freedom to feel important, while subtly limiting their capacity to disrupt the system. He did not crush ambition outright. He redirected it. This approach minimized resentment and reduced the likelihood of internal conflict. Trust, once given, was maintained through consistency rather than sentiment. Gigante did not reward loyalty with affection or favors. He rewarded it with stability. Those who followed his guidance found their positions secure. Those who deviated found themselves isolated, often without understanding how or why. The absence of a crown made Gigante's rule more resilient. There was no throne to challenge, no title to dispute. Authority existed as a network of relationships rather than a single point. This made it difficult for rivals to identify targets. It also made it difficult for law enforcement to build cases. Gigante's personal life reflected this restraint. He lived quietly, avoiding excess. He did not surround himself with visible signs of wealth or power. This modesty reinforced his public image as an unremarkable figure, further insulating him from suspicion. As the 80s progressed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. To the outside world, Gigante was a minor figure, occasionally mentioned but never central. Within the underworld, he was the final arbiter. This dual existence required constant vigilance. Any slip could expose the truth. Yet Gigante maintained the balance with remarkable consistency. He trusted the system he had helped shape. He trusted his instincts. He trusted time. Each year that passed without incident reinforced his belief that this approach was not just effective, but superior. The notion of being a boss without a crown was not unique to Gigante, but he embodied it more completely than anyone else. He did not need validation. His power was confirmed daily through compliance, through quiet acknowledgments, through the smooth functioning of the organization. This period represented the peak of his influence. He had achieved what few in his world ever managed, control without exposure. He had become indispensable without being visible. This invisibility was his greatest protection. And yet, beneath this calm surface, pressures were building. Law enforcement was evolving. New legal tools were emerging. Public attitudes toward organized crime were shifting. The very invisibility that protected Gigante would soon be tested in ways he could not fully anticipate. For now, however, the system held. The family moved quietly through the city, and Vincent Gigante remained at its center, unseen and unchallenged. The man without a crown ruled with patience and precision, convinced that as long as he remained invisible, he would remain untouchable. At some point during his ascent, Vincent Gigante began to understand that silence alone would not be enough forever. The world around him was changing. Law enforcement had grown more patient, more methodical. Prosecutors were learning how to build cases that did not rely on a single witness or a single moment of violence. Time, which had always been Gigante's ally, was slowly becoming a threat. And so, quietly and without announcement, he began constructing a second layer of protection, one far more unconventional than silence. It did not begin dramatically. There was no sudden transformation, no clear starting line. Instead, small changes appeared over time. A distracted look here. A delayed response there. He seemed less engaged, less aware. At first, these moments were subtle enough to be dismissed as fatigue or stress. But they persisted, and slowly, deliberately, they accumulated. Gigante understood something fundamental about human perception. People believe what they see repeatedly. A single odd behavior might raise suspicion, but consistency creates acceptance. He did not want to shock observers. He wanted to bore them. He wanted his behavior to become predictable in its strangeness. He began walking the streets dressed oddly, sometimes in a bathrobe, sometimes wearing slippers inappropriate for the season. He wandered without urgency, muttering to himself, appearing lost in thoughts that no one else could access. To neighbors, he looked like a man slipping away from reality. To police officers, he looked like someone not worth the paperwork. To prosecutors, he looked like a problem that would be difficult to explain to a jury. This was not chaos. It was discipline. The performance required absolute control. Any slip could undo years of preparation. Gigante never appeared lucid in public. He never corrected anyone. He never broke character, even in moments of frustration or inconvenience. If he was followed, he did not react. If he was questioned, he responded vaguely or not at all. Over time, this behavior created a narrative that others accepted and reinforced on his behalf. Psychiatrists were brought in. Evaluations were conducted. Gigante presented himself as confused, disoriented, incapable of sustained attention. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He allowed silence and ambiguity to do the work. Diagnoses followed. Legal records began to reflect mental instability. Each document added another brick to the wall he was building. The brilliance of the act lay in its restraint. Many men would have overplayed it, turning madness into spectacle. Gigante did the opposite. He kept it subdued, repetitive, almost dull. There were no emotional outbursts, no erratic violence. Just a steady, unchanging presentation of mental decline. This consistency made it believable. Inside the organization, only a few understood what was happening. Even among trusted associates, knowledge was compartmentalized. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer the illusion remained. Those who did know were instructed never to acknowledge it, not even indirectly. The act required collective discipline, and Gigante enforced it quietly. This new layer of protection served multiple purposes. It discouraged law enforcement from pursuing him aggressively. It complicated legal proceedings. It created doubt where certainty was required. Prosecutors could suspect his involvement, but suspicion alone was not enough. They needed to convince judges and juries that a man who appeared profoundly unwell was secretly orchestrating complex criminal enterprises. That was a difficult story to tell. The act also served a psychological function. It lowered expectations. People underestimated him. They dismissed him. They spoke freely around him, assuming he was not listening or not capable of understanding. Information flowed past him without caution. He absorbed it all. Walking the streets of New York, he became a fixture. Residents recognized him but did not question him. He was part of the landscape, like a broken streetlight or a familiar piece of graffiti. This normalization was essential. The more ordinary his presence became, the less anyone thought to examine it. Law enforcement officers encountered him repeatedly. They noted his behavior, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with pity. He was questioned, detained briefly, released. Each encounter reinforced the perception that he was harmless. Over time, this perception became institutional memory. Files were marked. Notes were written. The image of madness solidified. What made the act so effective was that it aligned perfectly with Gigante's existing habits. He was already quiet. Already withdrawn. Already patient. He did not need to invent a new personality. He only needed to exaggerate certain aspects of himself while suppressing others. The line between performance and reality blurred, not because he lost control, but because he never allowed anyone close enough to see the difference. Critically, the act was not static. It evolved subtly over time. As legal pressures increased, his apparent instability deepened. As scrutiny eased, it remained consistent. He adjusted details carefully, ensuring that the overall impression never changed. This adaptability kept observers off balance. Inside the mafia, reactions varied. Some found the behavior embarrassing. Others found it unsettling. But no one questioned its effectiveness. Gigante remained free. Operations continued uninterrupted. The family benefited directly from his invisibility. This strategy also reinforced the Genovese philosophy of faceless leadership. A boss who appeared mentally unfit could not easily be identified as a leader at all. Authority flowed through intermediaries, while Gigante remained shielded by doubt. There was also an element of irony in the act. The same society that feared organized crime was now protecting one of its most powerful figures through compassion and legal caution. Mental illness, rightly treated with sensitivity, became a barrier that law enforcement hesitated to cross. Gigante exploited this hesitation without ever acknowledging it. Maintaining the act required constant vigilance. He could not relax. He could not confide. Even moments of privacy were potential risks. He lived within the performance completely, allowing it to define his public existence. This level of commitment was rare and exhausting, but Gigante endured it without complaint. Years passed, and the act became legend. Stories circulated about the crazy old man wandering Greenwich Village. Few connected him to the quiet machinery of organized crime operating beneath the city's surface. Those who suspected were often dismissed as conspiracy-minded. The transformation was complete. Vincent Gigante had not disappeared. He had hidden in plain sight, using absurdity as camouflage. Madness became his shield, not because he lost his mind, but because he understood it better than anyone else. This was not a retreat from power. It was an evolution of it. As prosecutors refined their tools and rivals grew reckless, Gigante adapted. He did not challenge the system directly. He stepped outside its expectations entirely. The wandering man in the bathrobe was no accident. He was the final expression of a philosophy shaped over decades. Visibility is danger. Attention is liability. Survival belongs to those who can endure unseen. And for a time, the act worked perfectly. By 1987, Vincent Gigante existed in two realities at once, and neither could fully acknowledge the other. On the surface, he was a familiar sight in Manhattan's Greenwich Village, drifting along sidewalks in a bathrobe, his posture slouched, his gaze unfocused. To residents, he was part of the neighborhood's quiet eccentricity, no more threatening than a stray cat or a flickering street lamp. Beneath that surface, however, his influence reached into construction sites, union halls, gambling rooms, and private apartments where decisions were made that affected millions of dollars and countless lives. That year marked the height of his power, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No arrests slowed his operations. No internal rebellions challenged his authority. No public scandals exposed his role. The system he had spent decades refining was functioning exactly as intended. Silence, patience, and misdirection were doing their work. The mafia landscape of the late 1980s was shifting. Federal prosecutors had grown bolder, armed with RICO statutes and a growing willingness to turn insiders into witnesses. High-profile bosses from other families were being arrested, tried, and sentenced to long prison terms. Headlines followed them everywhere. Cameras captured their movements. Their names became synonymous with organized crime itself. In contrast, Gigante's name barely surfaced, and when it did, it was rarely taken seriously. This invisibility was not accidental. Gigante had positioned himself so that even those who suspected his role struggled to prove it. Orders were never delivered directly. Meetings were avoided whenever possible. Decisions traveled through layers of trusted intermediaries, each insulated from the next. By the time an instruction reached the street, its origin was obscured beyond recognition. Inside the Genovese family, 1987 was a year of stability. Revenue streams remained steady. Disputes were resolved quietly. There was no appetite for confrontation or expansion that might attract attention. Gigante favored continuity over growth, believing that survival depended on maintaining equilibrium rather than pushing boundaries. Those closest to him understood that caution was non-negotiable. He discouraged unnecessary meetings and limited exposure even among trusted figures. Physical proximity to him was rare. Communication relied on routine patterns designed to appear mundane. The less remarkable the behavior, the safer it was. Outside, law enforcement agencies faced a frustrating paradox. They believed Gigante was powerful, but they could not reconcile that belief with what they observed. Surveillance teams watched him wander aimlessly, sometimes stopping to stare at shop windows or sit on benches for hours. Informants described him as confused, detached, incapable of sustained focus. Medical evaluation supported this image. Each piece of evidence contradicted the idea of a calculating crime boss. Prosecutors debated strategy. Some argued that the insanity defense was a performance. Others worried that pursuing a case would risk public embarrassment if they failed to prove competence. The legal threshold for prosecuting someone deemed mentally unfit was high, and Gigante's presentation made it difficult to meet. Meanwhile, the city itself seemed to collaborate unknowingly in his disguise. New York in the 80s was accustomed to contradictions. Wealth and decay existed side by side. Eccentricity was tolerated, even celebrated. A man wandering in a bathrobe did not stand out for long. The city absorbed him and moved on. Gigante understood this environment intuitively. He did not rush his walks. He did not avoid familiar streets. Repetition was essential. The more often people saw him behaving the same way, the more ordinary it became. Familiarity bred indifference. Inside his own mind, discipline never wavered. The act required constant vigilance. Any moment of clarity displayed in public could unravel years of careful construction. He maintained the performance without interruption, even when it inconvenienced him. Even when it invited ridicule. Even when it required enduring the quiet humiliation of being dismissed as broken. Power, to Gigante, was never about pride. It was about survival. And survival, in 1987, meant remaining underestimated. The contrast with other mafia figures grew sharper as the year progressed. While rivals battled egos and publicity, Gigante receded further into ambiguity. He allowed others to draw fire. He allowed the spotlight to land elsewhere. This restraint preserved his position while others fell. Within the organization, his authority was absolute, though rarely articulated. Decisions attributed to him were accepted without debate. His judgment was trusted because it had proven effective. There was no need to remind anyone who was in control. The smooth operation of the family spoke for itself. The irony of 1987 was that Gigante's most visible behavior was also his greatest protection. The more he appeared in public as a harmless eccentric, the less likely anyone was to imagine the complexity beneath that surface. His visibility functioned as camouflage. As the year drew on, pressure from law enforcement continued to mount across the mafia world. Indictments multiplied. Trials filled court calendars. But Gigante remained untouched. His name surfaced in whispers, never in charges. The system held. For observers looking back, 1987 would come to symbolize the peak of his reign. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. It was the year when his strategy proved itself completely. When the gap between perception and reality was widest. At night, as he wandered the streets, the city slept around him, unaware that one of its most powerful figures moved among it unchallenged. The bathrobe fluttered lightly in the evening air. The slippers scuffed against the pavement. And behind that unassuming rhythm, an empire continued to function. In 1987, Vincent Gigante did not hide. He did something far more effective. He convinced the world that there was nothing worth looking for. As the years passed and Vincent Gigante's strange public behavior became a fixture of daily life, something subtle but powerful happened. The illusion no longer belonged solely to him. It began to belong to everyone around him. Neighbors, journalists, police officers, even casual passers-by all played a role in sustaining it, often without realizing they were doing so. The myth grew not because it was aggressively promoted, but because it was endlessly repeated. In Greenwich Village, people developed a familiarity with Gigante that felt almost affectionate. He was the odd man in the bathrobe, the one who wandered the same streets day after day, seemingly lost in a private world. Shop owners recognized him. Residents nodded as he passed. Some spoke of him with mild concern, others with amused tolerance. In a city where strangeness was common, he became a known quantity, and known quantities rarely invite scrutiny. This familiarity was critical. When something becomes routine, it loses its capacity to surprise. Gigante's behavior, once odd, became predictable. Predictability dulled curiosity. Curiosity, once dulled, gave way to indifference. And indifference was the most effective shield of all. Journalists occasionally took notice. Stories were written about the crazy old man wandering Manhattan, sometimes with hints and speculation about his rumored mafia ties. But these pieces were often framed as curiosities rather than investigations. The tone was light, almost dismissive. How could a man who appeared so disoriented possibly control a criminal empire? The contradiction itself became the story, and in becoming a story, it lost its urgency. Media attention, which destroyed so many others, slid off Gigante without effect. He did not grant interviews. He did not respond to accusations. He did not react at all. Without reaction, stories stalled. There was no drama to sustain interest. Editors moved on. Audiences forgot. Law enforcement, too, fell into patterns. Officers encountered Gigante repeatedly over the years. They noted his behavior, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with sympathy. He was questioned, briefly detained, released. Each encounter reinforced the same conclusion: this was not a man worth pursuing aggressively. The paperwork alone would outweigh the potential benefit. Over time, these interactions formed an institutional memory. Notes accumulated. Assessments were repeated. New officers learned from older ones. "That's just Chin," they were told. "He's not all there." This shorthand became doctrine. It shaped decisions long after the original evidence had gone stale. Psychiatrists and medical professionals contributed unintentionally as well. Their evaluations, based on Gigante's unwavering performance, produced diagnoses that entered official records. These diagnoses were not questioned aggressively because they aligned with what observers already believed. Confirmation bias did the rest. Each new assessment reinforced the last. Within the mafia world, the myth functioned differently. Associates and rivals alike were aware of Gigante's act, but even here, the illusion served a purpose. It discouraged challenges. Who would attempt to overthrow a man whose behavior made him unpredictable? Who would trust their own interpretation over a performance that had fooled courts and doctors? At the same time, Gigante's public image allowed those around him to underestimate him dangerously. Some spoke freely in his presence, assuming he was not listening. Others dismissed his reactions, mistaking silence for confusion. Information leaked not because he asked for it, but because people assumed he could not use it. The myth also protected those beneath him. If Gigante was perceived as incompetent, then those acting on his behalf appeared independent. This fragmentation made it harder to connect actions to intent, to build coherent cases. Each layer of misunderstanding added another degree of separation. Neighbors who might have questioned his behavior instead normalized it. They told newcomers about him casually, as part of the neighborhood's character. This informal storytelling mattered. It shaped expectations. It framed Gigante as harmless before anyone had a chance to question that framing. Even when rumors circulated more seriously, they often collapsed under their own weight. The image of a wandering, mumbling man was too strong, too consistent. It overwhelmed abstract claims of hidden power. People tend to trust what they can see. Gigante gave them something to see every day. The myth fed on itself. The more it was accepted, the less likely anyone was to challenge it. Challenging it required effort, imagination, and risk. It was easier to accept the surface explanation. Easier to look away. Gigante understood this dynamic deeply. He did not correct misconceptions. He did not attempt to guide the narrative. He allowed others to shape it in ways that suited him. This passivity was deceptive. In reality, it was an active strategy. By relinquishing control of the story, he ensured it would drift away from the truth. The passage of time strengthened the illusion further. Years passed without incident. No arrests. No revelations. Each uneventful year reinforced the idea that there was nothing to uncover. People stopped asking questions because questions had yielded nothing before. In this way, the myth became self-sustaining. It no longer required effort from Gigante. It existed independently, supported by habit, repetition, and collective assumption. Even those who suspected the truth found themselves isolated, their concerns dismissed as exaggeration. The city itself seemed complicit. New York had always been a place where extraordinary things happened quietly. People learned to mind their own business. Gigante benefited from this cultural instinct. His presence did not demand explanation. It simply existed. Behind the scenes, the machinery of organized crime continued to operate smoothly. Decisions were made. Money moved. Influence was exerted. The disconnect between perception and reality grew wider each year. What made this period remarkable was not just Gigante's deception, but the way society participated in it. The myth was not imposed. It was adopted. Repeated. Reinforced. It became a shared understanding that required no proof. In the end, the greatest strength of the illusion was its ordinariness. There was nothing sensational about a man wandering the streets. There was nothing dramatic about mental decline. These were familiar, almost comforting narratives. They reassured people that the world made sense. And so, Vincent Gigante continued to move through that world, wrapped in a story everyone believed because it asked so little of them. The Don who hid in plain sight did not vanish into darkness. He remained visible, and in doing so, became impossible to see. While the public watched Vincent Gigante wander the streets in apparent confusion, an entirely different rhythm pulsed beneath the surface, one that required precision, discipline, and a carefully engineered system of communication. Power, after all, cannot function without movement. Orders must be given. Disputes must be settled. Money must flow. The challenge was not whether Gigante could lead, but how leadership could exist without ever being seen. The answer lay in distance. Gigante almost never issued direct commands. Doing so would have left traces, patterns, and vulnerabilities. Instead, he relied on a network of trusted intermediaries, men chosen not for ambition or charisma, but for restraint. These individuals acted as conduits, not decision-makers. They carried messages without altering them, delivered guidance without explanation, and asked no unnecessary questions. Their value was measured not by initiative, but by accuracy. Communication often began indirectly. Gigante might listen to a situation described casually, without comment. Hours or days later, a response would arrive through a separate channel, framed not as an order, but as a suggestion or observation. This ambiguity was intentional. It allowed instructions to be interpreted as consensus rather than command, reducing the risk of exposure. Words themselves were chosen carefully. Direct language was avoided. Instead, metaphors, references, and shared understandings carried meaning. A single phrase could signal approval or disapproval without stating either explicitly. This style of communication required a shared cultural fluency, one developed over years of working together. Outsiders could listen without understanding. Insiders understood without listening closely. Meetings, when they occurred at all, were brief and deliberately unremarkable. Locations were chosen for their ordinariness. There were no dramatic gatherings, no ritualized displays of hierarchy. The goal was to appear forgettable. Participants often left without fully realizing the significance of what had been decided. Gigante rarely appeared at these meetings himself. His presence was unnecessary and dangerous. Instead, he remained physically distant, allowing others to act as his voice. This separation provided insulation. If law enforcement observed or recorded a conversation, it would lead only to an intermediary, not to him. Information flowed upward as cautiously as orders flowed downward. Reports were fragmented, delivered in pieces through different people. This prevented any single individual from holding a complete picture. Gigante assembled these fragments mentally, constructing an understanding of events without ever appearing to receive a briefing. This system demanded absolute trust. One careless intermediary could compromise everything. Gigante selected his messengers carefully, favoring those who demonstrated consistency over time. Loyalty was proven through behavior, not declarations. Men who talked too much, who speculated, or who sought recognition were excluded quietly. The system also allowed Gigante to maintain plausible deniability. If questioned, intermediaries could truthfully claim they never received direct orders. They had acted based on conversations, interpretations, and shared expectations. This ambiguity protected everyone involved. Money moved through similarly indirect channels. Profits from various enterprises were distributed without drawing attention. Legitimate businesses served as buffers, blurring the line between legal income and criminal revenue. Accountants and handlers managed details, while Gigante remained removed from transactional specifics. Distance again provided protection. Enforcement within the organization followed the same philosophy. Discipline was maintained quietly. Problems were addressed before they escalated. Public displays of punishment were avoided unless absolutely necessary. Fear was less effective than predictability. Gigante understood that stability depended on minimizing shock. This approach contrasted sharply with the more theatrical styles employed by other crime families. Where others relied on intimidation and visibility, Gigante relied on structure. His system did not depend on personal presence. It could function even if he were absent. This resilience was by design. Law enforcement struggled to penetrate this network. Surveillance yielded fragments, but fragments without context are meaningless. Wiretaps captured conversations that sounded mundane. Meetings appeared social. Transactions seemed legitimate. Each piece, examined alone, revealed nothing. Even informants had difficulty providing clarity. Those who cooperated often knew only their immediate contacts. They could describe actions, but not intent. They could name individuals, but not leaders. Gigante remained abstract, a presence inferred rather than observed. The brilliance of the system was its simplicity. It did not rely on complex technology or elaborate schemes. It relied on human behavior, on habits formed through repetition. People did what they had always done, and in doing so, maintained the structure. Gigante's role within this system was less that of a commander and more that of a calibrator. He adjusted flows, corrected imbalances, and ensured continuity. He did not need to micromanage. He trusted the system to function. This trust was not blind. It was earned through years of observation. Gigante knew who could be relied upon and who could not. He knew where information might leak and where it would not. His distance allowed him to see patterns others missed. The absence of direct orders also created a psychological effect. Those carrying out actions felt a sense of ownership. They believed they were acting responsibly, not merely obeying commands. This reduced resentment and increased commitment. The system appeared organic rather than imposed. At the center of it all, Gigante remained still. He listened. He waited. He spoke rarely. His authority did not come from volume or force, but from consistency. When guidance came from him, it was trusted because it had always proven correct. This invisible command structure allowed Gigante to lead without appearing to lead. It was leadership disguised as absence. Control masked as passivity. To the outside world, nothing seemed to connect. To those within, everything flowed smoothly. The system did not announce itself. It simply worked. And as long as it worked, Vincent Gigante remained exactly where he wanted to be, everywhere in effect, nowhere in appearance. As the years of quiet control accumulated, another force began to shape Vincent Gigante's world just as powerfully as patience had, suspicion. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself loudly. It seeped in slowly, carried by the same silence that had once protected him. In an environment where loyalty was everything and betrayal was always a possibility, trust could never be complete. Gigante understood this better than anyone, and as his authority deepened, so did his vigilance. Paranoia, in his case, was not irrational. It was calculated. He had watched other leaders fall not because they lacked power, but because they trusted too freely. Informants had become the greatest threat to organized crime. Men who once would have endured prison rather than speak were now cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences. Technology had advanced. Wiretaps were more effective. Surveillance was more discreet. The margins for error were shrinking. Gigante responded by tightening control, but never openly. He did not issue sweeping decrees or dramatic warnings. Instead, he refined existing rules, making them more precise, more demanding. Communication channels were narrowed. Intermediaries were rotated. No one was allowed to grow too comfortable or too central. Comfort bred carelessness, and carelessness invited exposure. He limited the number of people who could speak on any given matter. Knowledge became compartmentalized to an extreme degree. Men were expected to know only what they needed to perform their specific function. Curiosity was discouraged. Questions were interpreted as weakness or ambition. Silence became both a shield and a test. Even trusted figures felt the pressure. Meetings were reduced further. Physical contact was avoided whenever possible. Messages that once traveled quickly now moved slowly, intentionally delayed to minimize patterns. Gigante believed that time could absorb risk. The slower the movement, the harder it was to trace. His paranoia extended to personal behavior. He varied routines subtly, avoiding predictability without drawing attention. He avoided discussing sensitive matters even in private settings. Walls, he assumed, could listen. So could people. This constant vigilance affected the organization's internal atmosphere. Fear did not dominate, but tension existed beneath the surface. Associates understood that mistakes would not be forgiven easily. Discipline was strict, though rarely enforced publicly. Consequences, when they came, arrived quietly and decisively. Punishment under Gigante's rule was understated. There were no theatrical displays meant to intimidate. Instead, those who violated trust found themselves isolated. Opportunities disappeared. Access was revoked. In some cases, the consequences were final, but even then, they were handled without spectacle. The absence of explanation was often more unsettling than any threat. This approach reinforced control. People complied not because they feared outbursts, but because they feared exclusion. Being cut off from the network meant vulnerability. It meant exposure. Gigante understood that fear of isolation was more powerful than fear of violence. At the same time, his paranoia created distance. Relationships within the organization became more transactional, less personal. Loyalty was assumed but never fully embraced. This distance protected Gigante, but it also eroded the warmth that might have existed in earlier years. He accepted this trade-off. Emotional closeness was a liability. Internally, Gigante wrestled with the burden of constant suspicion. He trusted few, and even those few were never trusted completely. This was not a sign of instability, but realism. In his world, betrayal was not a matter of if, but when. Preparation was the only defense. As law enforcement pressure intensified, his paranoia seemed justified. Arrests and indictments elsewhere reinforced his belief that caution was essential. Each downfall confirmed his approach. Each conviction validated his restraint. Yet paranoia had its costs. Decision-making slowed. Opportunities were missed. Some within the organization grew frustrated with the cautious pace. They saw rivals acting boldly and wondered if restraint had become stagnation. Gigante did not respond to these sentiments directly. He believed survival mattered more than expansion. He also understood that paranoia could be contagious. Too much suspicion could fracture loyalty, turning allies into potential threats. To prevent this, he balanced vigilance with consistency. Rules were clear. Expectations were stable. As long as people adhered to them, they were safe. This balance was delicate. Too much control invited rebellion. Too little invited betrayal. Gigante walked this line carefully, adjusting as needed. His experience had taught him that leadership was not static. It required constant recalibration. His own isolation deepened. The act of feigned madness further separated him from others. Few felt comfortable around him, and that discomfort served his purposes. It reduced the likelihood of casual conversation. It discouraged familiarity. The act was not only for the outside world. It functioned internally as well. Associates spoke to him cautiously, never sure how much he was listening or understanding. This uncertainty kept them guarded. Guarded men made fewer mistakes. As years passed, the contrast between Gigante's outward appearance and inward control grew starker. To outsiders, he seemed increasingly detached. To insiders, he remained alert, calculating, and deeply aware of threats. Paranoia became part of his leadership style, but it was not erratic. It was systematic. It shaped policy, behavior, and culture. It reinforced the Genovese family's reputation for discipline and secrecy. Yet even the most careful systems cannot eliminate risk entirely. The very measures designed to protect Gigante also isolated him, limiting his ability to adapt quickly. Information, filtered through layers of caution, sometimes arrived too late or incomplete. This was the cost of extreme control. Still, Gigante believed the trade was worth it. In a world where exposure meant destruction, caution was not weakness. It was survival. As the pressures of time and scrutiny continued to mount, his paranoia hardened into certainty. Someone, somewhere, would eventually talk. The question was not whether the walls would close in, but when. And until that moment arrived, Vincent Gigante would remain vigilant, tightening his grip not through force, but through distance, silence, and an unyielding awareness that trust, once given, could never be fully reclaimed. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the balance Vincent Gigante had maintained for so long began to shift in ways that could not be ignored. The streets still accepted his wandering presence, and the illusion of mental instability still held in public. But elsewhere, far from the sidewalks of Greenwich Village, a different kind of patience was taking shape. It belonged to prosecutors, investigators, and analysts who had learned, slowly and painfully, that the old methods no longer worked against men like him. The federal government had changed its approach. Rather than chasing individual crimes and hoping to tie them back to leadership, investigators now focused on patterns. RICO laws had given them a framework to treat organized crime not as isolated acts, but as a continuing enterprise. This shift mattered deeply. It meant that silence, which had once been an impenetrable shield, was no longer enough on its own. Investigators began to think in decades rather than months. They mapped relationships instead of crimes. They collected fragments patiently, storing them away without forcing connections prematurely. Wiretaps were installed not to capture dramatic confessions, but to observe habits. Surveillance teams watched quietly, sometimes for years, content to learn routines rather than intervene. Gigante sensed the change. He did not know specifics, but he understood the atmosphere. Pressure felt different now. It was less visible, less aggressive, but more persistent. The government was no longer reacting. It was waiting. This waiting mirrored his own strategy, and that made it dangerous. When two sides adopt the same patience, the contest becomes one of endurance. Gigante responded by tightening controls even further. Communication slowed. Layers thickened. The distance between him and actionable decisions grew. Prosecutors faced an immense challenge. They suspected Gigante was the real boss of the Genovese family, but suspicion was not evidence. They needed witnesses. They needed corroboration. They needed to pierce not just one layer of insulation, but many. Informants began to emerge, though rarely with complete knowledge. Some provided insight into specific operations. Others described hierarchy without clarity. Many spoke in generalities. Each piece alone was insufficient. Together, they hinted at a larger picture that remained frustratingly incomplete. Wiretaps captured conversations that sounded mundane. Men discussed meetings, favors, disputes, but rarely named names. Instructions were implied rather than stated. Prosecutors listened carefully, learning the language, decoding references. This process took time. Years, in some cases. Gigante's act of insanity complicated everything. Defense attorneys argued that even if evidence suggested involvement, it was meaningless without competence. Doctors testified. Records accumulated. The legal threshold for prosecuting someone deemed mentally unfit remained high. Prosecutors knew that a failed attempt could strengthen Gigante's position by reinforcing the illusion. So they waited. This waiting frustrated some agents, but leadership understood the necessity. They watched other bosses fall. They learned from those cases. They refined their approach. Each conviction elsewhere served as a rehearsal for what they hoped to achieve with Gigante. Inside the Genovese family, tension increased subtly. Associates sensed the tightening net, even if they did not see it directly. Arrests in other families created unease. Cooperation agreements became more common. The idea that someone might talk no longer felt theoretical. Gigante adjusted again. He reduced exposure further. He limited who could speak to whom. He relied increasingly on long-trusted figures while testing their loyalty quietly. The system became even more rigid, more cautious. Yet rigidity carried its own risks. Information moved slowly. Decision-making lagged. Some opportunities passed unclaimed. Gigante accepted these losses as the cost of survival. Growth mattered less than endurance. Prosecutors, meanwhile, began to see progress. Threads connected. Patterns emerged. They built timelines that suggested continuity of leadership rather than fragmentation. They gathered testimony that placed Gigante's influence consistently at the center, even if indirectly. Still, they resisted the urge to act prematurely. A weak case would fail, and failure would strengthen Gigante's defenses. They needed a moment when evidence, witnesses, and legal strategy aligned perfectly. The city outside remained largely unaware of this quiet struggle. Life continued. Gigante's walks continued. The bathrobe still fluttered in the breeze. To the public, nothing had changed. Behind the scenes, however, the machinery of law enforcement was turning steadily. Each report filed, each conversation recorded, each informant debriefed added weight. The case was not built in a single dramatic push, but through accumulation. Gigante felt the pressure without seeing its shape. He trusted his instincts. He trusted his systems. He believed that patience had carried him this far and would continue to protect him. But time, which had always been his ally, was now being used against him. The government's patience did not waver. Years passed. Evidence matured. Witnesses aged. Memories solidified into testimony. What had once been rumors hardened into narratives. Eventually, the distance Gigante had relied upon began to shrink, not because he moved closer, but because others moved closer quietly. The law did not rush. It waited, learning his methods, adapting to his rhythm. This phase marked the beginning of the end, though it did not yet look like one. There were no headlines announcing it. No arrest signaling a breakthrough. Just a sense, faint but persistent, that the long game had gained a second player equally committed to waiting. And in that silent contest between patience and patience, the outcome would depend not on who acted first, but on who could endure longest without making a mistake. Eventually, the performance that had protected Vincent Gigante for so long began to encounter a different kind of scrutiny. It was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. Like everything else in his story, it unfolded slowly, driven by accumulation rather than confrontation. The same patience that prosecutors had cultivated was now applied to the very foundation of his defense, the claim that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. For years, doctors had examined him and recorded observations consistent with confusion, disorientation, and cognitive decline. These evaluations had entered the legal record, reinforcing the image Gigante projected so carefully. But medicine, like law enforcement, does not remain static. Standards evolved. New experts were consulted. Older assumptions were revisited. And quietly, questions began to form. Some physicians noticed inconsistencies that could not be ignored. Gigante's behavior, while convincingly impaired in public, appeared oddly selective. He could maintain routines with remarkable precision. He navigated the city without getting lost. He appeared confused, yet rarely made mistakes that endangered himself. These observations did not prove deception, but they introduced doubt. Prosecutors seized on this doubt cautiously. They understood that challenging the insanity defense required more than suspicion. They needed credible medical testimony, sustained observation, and evidence of intentional performance. Any misstep could collapse years of work. Gigante, for his part, continued the act without variation. If he sensed the shift, he did not reveal it. His public demeanor remained unchanged. He wandered. He muttered. He appeared detached. The consistency was impressive, even under increasing examination. Court-ordered evaluations intensified. Doctors observed him over longer periods, in controlled environments. They compared notes. Patterns emerged. While Gigante appeared impaired, he also displayed moments of awareness that seemed difficult to reconcile with genuine mental illness. These moments were fleeting, subtle, and often dismissed individually. Together, they formed a troubling picture. The question shifted from whether Gigante was mentally ill to whether he was exaggerating or fabricating symptoms. This distinction mattered enormously. The law treated incompetence with caution, but deliberate deception was another matter entirely. Defense attorneys responded aggressively. They emphasized Gigante's long history of documented illness. They highlighted expert testimony supporting the diagnosis. They warned against overconfidence. Mental illness, they argued, did not follow neat patterns. It could fluctuate. It could mask itself. The courtroom became a battleground of interpretation rather than fact. Doctors debated diagnoses. Lawyers debated credibility. Judges listened carefully, aware that their decisions would set precedents. Outside the courtroom, the Genovese family watched with unease. The illusion that had protected their leader for decades was under threat. Some worried that increased scrutiny would expose not only Gigante, but the structure he controlled. Others trusted that his discipline would hold. Gigante himself remained outwardly unchanged. He did not argue. He did not react. He allowed others to speak for him. This passivity was both genuine in appearance and strategic in function. Any display of emotion could be interpreted as clarity. Behind the scenes, prosecutors strengthened their case in parallel. They gathered testimony from cooperating witnesses who described Gigante's role in detail. They aligned this testimony with financial records, intercepted communications, and observed behavior. Slowly, a narrative emerged that contradicted the image of incapacity. The turning point did not come from a single revelation, but from convergence. Medical doubt aligned with testimonial evidence. Legal arguments aligned with observed patterns. The illusion, once airtight, began to show seams. Judges became less willing to accept blanket claims of incompetence. Orders were issued. Hearings were scheduled. The legal process moved forward cautiously but decisively. For Gigante, this was the most dangerous phase of all. The act that had shielded him now placed him under intense focus. Every gesture, every word, every silence was analyzed. The very consistency that had once protected him was now being examined for signs of artifice. Yet even here, he did not abandon the performance. To do so would have been catastrophic. He maintained the same demeanor he had cultivated for years, trusting that endurance had saved him before and might do so again. The psychological toll of this scrutiny was immense. Living within a performance is one thing. Defending it under relentless examination is another. But Gigante had prepared for this. His entire life had been an exercise in restraint. As hearings progressed, rulings narrowed his options. Courts increasingly questioned the legitimacy of his incompetence claims. The possibility of trial loomed closer. Inside the organization, contingency plans were quietly considered. Leadership structures adjusted. Intermediaries prepared for scenarios once thought impossible. The system had been designed to function without Gigante's physical presence, but his symbolic presence had always mattered. When the courts finally ruled that Gigante was competent to stand trial, the decision felt both inevitable and shocking. Decades of performance had delayed this moment, but not prevented it. The fall of the illusion was not dramatic. There was no public confession. No moment where Gigante revealed clarity. Instead, the act simply lost its legal power. What had once been accepted without question was now subject to challenge. For the first time in years, Vincent Gigante faced the full weight of the system he had evaded for so long. The bathrobe, the wandering, the muttering, all of it remained. But the shield they provided was weakening. The long performance had bought him time. Decades of it. But time, which had always been his greatest ally, had finally turned. The illusion did not collapse in a single moment. It eroded. And in that erosion lay the quiet beginning of the end. Vincent Gigante's conviction was not accompanied by the chaos and spectacle that often surrounded the downfall of prominent mafia figures. There were no dramatic shootouts, no crowds gathering outside courthouses, no flashing cameras capturing a defiant moment. Instead, it was a quiet, methodical culmination of years of investigation, patience, and legal strategy. The man who had spent decades wandering the streets in a bathrobe, creating a persona of confusion and incapacity, had finally been brought to account. The courtroom, filled with lawyers, judges, and observers, became the stage upon which the final act of his decades-long game would play out. The trial itself was painstaking. Prosecutors, having spent years gathering evidence, presented a comprehensive case against him. It was not a case built on a single crime or a single witness, but on the accumulation of decades of criminal activity. Organized crime is, by its very nature, a diffuse and complicated enterprise. Proving Gigante's central role required connecting multiple layers: money laundering, labor racketeering, extortion, and influence over unions and legitimate businesses. Each piece of evidence was painstakingly documented, and each witness carefully prepared to testify without exposing themselves to retaliation. The meticulousness of the prosecution mirrored the meticulousness of Gigante's own operations, creating an ironic symmetry between hunter and hunted. Defense attorneys worked tirelessly to maintain the long-standing narrative of mental incapacity. They highlighted Gigante's erratic public behavior, the wandering, the muttering, and the documented medical evaluations that had, for decades, reinforced the appearance of a man incapable of leading an organized crime family. Yet, the prosecution had anticipated these arguments. They countered by presenting evidence of deliberate behavior, decisions made with precision, actions coordinated across multiple intermediaries, and financial records that indicated strategic control. Slowly, the narrative that had shielded him for so long began to erode under the weight of accumulated proof. Throughout the proceedings, Gigante maintained his calm demeanor. He did not react visibly to the mounting pressure. He did not engage with the press or the court. His act of public disorientation, once a shield, was now under scrutiny, and yet he preserved it with the same disciplined consistency that had defined his life. To observers, it seemed almost impossible to gauge his awareness. Was he performing, as he had for decades, or had the weight of exposure finally penetrated his careful defenses? The ambiguity itself was part of the strategy, a final layer of control, even as the legal system tightened around him. When the verdict was delivered, the court found him guilty on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy, with clear evidence linking him to organized crime leadership. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Unlike other mafia bosses whose convictions might provoke immediate public outrage or dramatic retaliation, the announcement was met with quiet acknowledgement. For Gigante, the impact was profound, yet consistent with the life he had built. He had prepared for this eventuality, understanding that no defense, no performance, could ultimately guarantee immunity against the relentless persistence of the law. Prison, once again, became his environment. But this time, it was different. He was no longer maneuvering as an emerging figure within the underworld, nor as a covert manipulator of operations. He was a convicted leader, removed from the streets and subject to the formal structures of incarceration. The power he once exercised invisibly over thousands of people was now diminished in its scope, though the knowledge of his past influence still colored interactions around him. Fellow inmates, guards, and administrators understood the gravity of his history, and his reputation preceded him, even in the context of a confined life. The transition was not marked by despair or dramatic adjustment. Gigante's life had always been defined by discipline and control, and those qualities translated into his approach to prison. He navigated the system with careful observation, assessing hierarchies, alliances, and potential threats. Though he could no longer command operations directly, he maintained an air of quiet authority. Those around him recognized that he had been a figure of consequence, and the respect or caution this commanded became a subtle form of influence within the prison walls. His conviction also sent ripples through the Genovese crime family. The removal of their leader, even one who had operated in the shadows, required adaptation. The family had always been structured to endure the absence or incapacitation of a boss, but the loss of Gigante was significant. Intermediaries adjusted roles, responsibilities shifted, and decision-making was redistributed to ensure continuity. The system he had perfected allowed the organization to persist without disruption, a testament to the effectiveness of the invisible control he had maintained for decades. The psychological aspect of the conviction was equally profound. For decades, Gigante had relied on perception, discipline, and patience to evade full accountability. The act of feigned mental instability had protected him, delayed prosecution, and allowed him to manage both risk and opportunity. The conviction represented the ultimate test of his strategies against the mechanisms of law and society. It was a moment where preparation, patience, and cunning were measured against the persistence of investigation and the accumulation of evidence. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, there was an almost surreal quality to Gigante's existence. A man who had once seemed omnipresent in the operations of an entire city now moved through the prison system as just another inmate, albeit one with a unique and storied history. The paradox of his life, visibility paired with invisibility, influence paired with isolation, remained intact in many ways, even as the legal system asserted its authority. The conviction also highlighted the limits of performance and deception. While the feigned madness had delayed prosecution and confused authorities for decades, it could not ultimately substitute for evidence, testimony, and sustained legal scrutiny. The gap between appearance and reality had been bridged, not by public revelation, but by the methodical accumulation of facts, corroborated by multiple sources. In this sense, Gigante's downfall was as quiet and deliberate as his rise, a reflection of the world he had spent his life navigating. Life imprisonment imposed new boundaries, but it did not entirely erase the legacy of Vincent Gigante. The reputation he had built, the systems he had designed, and the myth he had cultivated continued to influence those who had interacted with him. Associates still deferred in subtle ways, observers still spoke of his past authority, and law enforcement studied the structures he had controlled. His influence persisted in memory and practice, even as his personal autonomy was curtailed. Ultimately, Gigante's conviction was a study in contrasts. The man who had hidden in plain sight, who had walked the streets appearing incapable of coherent thought, was now formally and unmistakably recognized as one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history. The calmness of the trial, the methodical nature of the investigation, and the quiet acceptance of his sentence mirrored the life he had led, disciplined, calculated, and extraordinarily controlled. The life sentence was both an end and a reflection of a lifetime spent perfecting the art of influence without exposure. Even as he entered the final phase of his public and private life, the paradox that had defined him remained. A man of immense power and careful strategy was reduced to a body within prison walls, yet his reputation, systems, and legacy continued to cast long shadows beyond them. The conviction marked a closure of sorts, yet it was entirely consistent with the ethos that had guided Vincent Gigante for decades, a life in which control, patience, and perception mattered more than visibility, and where the true extent of one's influence often remained unseen until the world was forced to reckon with it. Prison, for Vincent Gigante, was a different world than the one he had navigated outside. The streets of Manhattan, with their shadows and subtle hierarchies, had allowed him to move freely, hidden in plain sight, controlling networks through intermediaries, and sustaining an illusion that kept law enforcement and rivals alike at bay. Behind bars, the dynamic changed fundamentally. He no longer dictated the movement of money, the resolution of disputes, or the quiet operations of the Genovese family. Yet even within confinement, Gigante's mind and reputation allowed him to exert influence in ways that were subtle but remarkably effective. From the moment he entered prison, Gigante relied on the same principles that had guided him throughout his life: patience, observation, and restraint. He understood that behavior under scrutiny had consequences far beyond the immediate. In this new environment, the stakes were personal safety, continued respect, and the maintenance of his influence, even if indirectly. He did not announce himself as a figure of power. He did not demand deference. Instead, he allowed the weight of his history to speak quietly to those around him. Other inmates were aware of who he had been. Rumors of his wandering Manhattan streets, of the bathrobe, of the careful act of feigned insanity, had traveled ahead of him. Men who might have tested a newcomer's resolve or challenged authority thought twice in his presence. The aura of his past created a buffer. They did not fully understand the extent of his operations, nor did they need to. The combination of reputation, experience, and restraint ensured that Gigante was treated with a level of respect disproportionate to his immediate physical presence. His day-to-day life in prison was governed by the same disciplined structure he had long cultivated. He adhered to routines quietly and consistently, moving through the rhythms of incarceration with minimal incident. Meals, counts, recreational periods, and restricted movements became predictable not because he sought comfort but because predictability was a form of control. Through these actions, he signaled stability, composure, and endurance, qualities that commanded respect in an environment where volatility was common and often dangerous. While his direct control over the outside world was curtailed, Gigante maintained influence through intermediaries and careful communication. He understood that messages could travel indirectly, that guidance could be given without exposure, and that trust established over decades did not evaporate simply because walls and bars separated him from the street. Associates outside the prison system were careful to convey instructions in ways that preserved his safety while ensuring operations continued smoothly. This distance, far from weakening his authority, reinforced the disciplined insulation that had been central to his leadership style. The challenges of incarceration, however, were not limited to maintaining influence. They were also deeply psychological. Gigante had long relied on performance and discipline to navigate a world of constant scrutiny. In prison, the scrutiny was magnified, and yet he could no longer rely solely on outward appearances. He was surrounded by men whose observation and intuition were focused intensely on one another, each assessing potential threats, alliances, and weaknesses. Maintaining composure required constant attention, a mental vigilance that was exhausting in its subtlety. Even within this constrained environment, Gigante exercised judgment and control where he could. He avoided unnecessary confrontations but did not shrink from necessary ones. He assessed conflicts with patience, allowing them to resolve or escalate only when intervention was strategically warranted. By choosing when and how to act, he continued to influence the social dynamics around him, preserving both personal safety and a quiet measure of authority. Health, of course, became an increasingly relevant factor. The years had not been kind, and incarceration brought its own strains. Medical care, limited and bureaucratic, required careful navigation. Gigante approached it methodically. He followed schedules, sought care strategically, and maintained as much autonomy as possible. Even the management of his physical condition became an exercise in discipline, consistent with a lifetime of strategic thinking. Interactions with guards and administrators were similarly deliberate. Gigante did not seek favoritism or special treatment. He behaved predictably, neither challenging authority unnecessarily nor drawing attention. Yet his history and demeanor commanded a subtle deference. Staff learned quickly that he was not a man to provoke, but neither was he easily manipulated. Boundaries were respected without formal assertion, his reputation preceded him, providing protection through perception as much as through behavior. Psychologically, prison life reinforced lessons he had internalized long ago: patience is power, silence is protection, and observation is control. Every conversation, every movement, every pause in routine offered insight into the environment. Gigante's experience outside, decades of navigating hierarchies, avoiding detection, and exercising influence without visibility, provided him with a toolkit uniquely suited to the structured and constrained life behind bars. Whereas many inmates were reactive, driven by immediate threats or emotional impulses, he remained reflective, calculating, and deliberate. The isolation imposed by incarceration also had a paradoxical benefit. Freed from the constant pressures of active leadership, Gigante could reflect deeply on the structures he had built and the strategies he had employed. He could observe the outside world indirectly, through intermediaries, news, and occasional communication, without risking exposure. This allowed him to consider contingency plans, anticipate legal developments, and evaluate the ongoing state of the family he had led. Even confined, his mind remained a hub of calculation. Relationships within prison walls were managed with similar precision. He did not seek friendship or intimacy. He cultivated cautious respect. Interactions were limited, purposeful, and strategically neutral. Men around him understood his history, and this understanding created a space in which he could operate without constant challenge. Authority, in his case, was less about active enforcement and more about the quiet assertion of presence and the anticipation of risk. Time in prison was both a continuation and a test of the strategies he had relied on all his life. Discipline, patience, and observation remained essential. Each day reinforced the notion that survival was more about endurance and calculated behavior than about confrontation or aggression. Every routine, every action, every decision, became part of a larger strategy to preserve influence, maintain safety, and navigate the complexities of a constrained and monitored environment. Even as his freedom was limited, the legacy of his authority persisted. The networks he had built remained operational. Associates outside continued to defer to the systems he had put in place. The principles of indirect control, compartmentalization, and discretion ensured that the family he had led continued to function, even in his absence. This continuation provided a form of security and validation that reinforced his own sense of effectiveness and purpose. Ultimately, Gigante's prison years were a reflection of the life he had always led: disciplined, observant, and patient. The environment had changed, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Authority was maintained not through spectacle, but through restraint. Power persisted not through visibility, but through the structures he had created and the consistency of his behavior. Even behind bars, Vincent Gigante remained, in many ways, exactly as he had been in the streets: calm, calculating, and quietly commanding respect, a figure whose presence shaped events far beyond the walls that confined him. Vincent Gigante's impact on organized crime extended far beyond the literal confines of the streets he once walked or the prison cell that ultimately contained him. His methods, his philosophy of leadership, and his deliberate cultivation of invisibility reshaped not only the Genovese crime family but the broader understanding of what it meant to wield power in the underworld. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied on visibility, intimidation, and flamboyance to command respect, Gigante demonstrated that influence could be exercised quietly, methodically, and without spectacle. This approach left a legacy that endured long after his personal presence faded. One of the most remarkable aspects of his influence was the system he created, one in which decision-making flowed through layers of intermediaries, communication was indirect, and authority remained deliberately obscured. In practical terms, this meant that the organization could function smoothly even in the absence of its visible leadership. Orders could be carried out, conflicts resolved, and operations sustained without revealing the identity of those truly in control. By decentralizing perception while centralizing authority in practice, Gigante created resilience that was rare in organized crime. Other families often relied on the presence of an unmistakable boss whose removal or arrest could destabilize the entire structure. Gigante showed that invisibility could be a superior form of protection, one that shielded both him and the organization simultaneously. His approach forced law enforcement to rethink traditional investigative methods. Prior to Gigante, authorities often relied on visible patterns of behavior, public appearances, and overt connections to build cases against organized crime leaders. Gigante's success in hiding in plain sight, feigning mental incapacity, and insulating himself behind layers of trusted intermediaries made it extremely difficult to tie criminal acts directly to him. Prosecutors and FBI agents had to adapt, employing patience and long-term surveillance rather than relying on quick indictments. They had to connect fragments of information across years, listening for patterns in seemingly innocuous conversations and analyzing financial transactions for indirect links. The legal landscape for prosecuting organized crime changed because of him, and the methods developed to address his strategies became a blueprint for future investigations into high-level mafia activity. Within the Genovese family, his influence was equally profound. The culture of discretion, compartmentalization, and patience that defined his leadership became embedded in the organization's operational DNA. Associates learned to rely on indirect communication, to understand that silence could be more valuable than speech, and to respect authority without the need for constant demonstration. Ambition was tempered by an understanding of risk, and loyalty was measured through consistency rather than flamboyant gestures. These lessons endured even after his removal from active leadership, shaping the behavior of generations of mobsters who followed. Gigante's emphasis on perception as a tool of control also left a lasting mark. He demonstrated that appearances could be weaponized, that the projection of weakness could conceal extraordinary strength, and that human psychology could be manipulated without violence. Law enforcement, neighbors, and even some associates underestimated him because of his performance, which allowed him to operate freely and strategically. This manipulation of perception became a case study in the power of subtlety, showing that dominance does not always require visibility or aggression. Influence can be exercised as effectively through what is not seen as through what is. The contrast between Gigante and contemporaries such as John Gotti further illustrates his enduring impact. Gotti embraced the spotlight, cultivated a public persona, and used notoriety as a tool of intimidation. Gigante, by contrast, operated invisibly, letting his influence ripple through networks and systems rather than through spectacle. The two approaches highlighted different philosophies of leadership, one based on fear and visibility, the other on patience and control. In retrospect, many analysts have argued that Gigante's methods were more sustainable, precisely because they relied on structures rather than personalities. When Gotti fell, his organization was destabilized, while the Genovese family continued to function despite Gigante's imprisonment, a testament to the robustness of his approach. The legal consequences of his career also contributed to his legacy. His feigned mental illness and deliberate obfuscation challenged courts and prosecutors, raising complex questions about competency, criminal responsibility, and the limits of legal strategy. The cases surrounding Gigante required judges to consider evidence in nuanced ways, balancing observable behavior against documented actions and testimony. These legal precedents influenced future prosecutions of organized crime leaders, illustrating the need for comprehensive investigation and careful interpretation of behavioral evidence. In this sense, Gigante's influence extended into the legal system itself, shaping how the law approached complex criminal networks. Beyond the tactical and legal dimensions, Gigante's story left a cultural imprint. He became a symbol of cunning and subtlety, an example of a figure who could command immense power without ever being overtly visible. Stories of his wandering in bathrobes, muttering in the streets, and eluding scrutiny became part of the lore of organized crime. While sensationalized in popular accounts, these tales also serve to illustrate the principles underlying his power: patience, observation, discretion, and the strategic use of perception. For those studying criminal behavior, leadership, or organizational dynamics, Gigante's career offers lessons that transcend the mafia context, demonstrating how control and influence can be exercised through structure, psychology, and the careful management of appearances. Even in prison, where his direct control over operations was limited, the impact of his systems persisted. Associates outside continued to operate within the frameworks he had established. The Genovese family adapted to his absence without disruption, and his name retained a weight that commanded respect and caution. Influence, in his case, had become institutional rather than personal. This structural legacy ensured that his approach would continue to shape decisions and behavior long after he was physically removed from the streets. Ultimately, Vincent Gigante's influence is defined by contrast, the juxtaposition of apparent weakness and hidden power, of public absurdity and private control, of performance and reality. He demonstrated that the most effective form of leadership does not always rely on visibility or confrontation, but on systems, patience, and the careful orchestration of perception. His methods challenged both allies and adversaries, forcing law enforcement to evolve, shaping the behavior of organized crime families, and leaving an enduring lesson on the strategic use of invisibility. His legacy is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a study in the principles of power, the management of risk, and the psychology of influence. Vincent Gigante did not merely survive in the world of organized crime, he redefined what it meant to lead within it, showing that the most enduring authority is often exercised quietly, invisibly, and with unwavering patience. The lessons of his life continue to resonate, both within criminal organizations and in broader considerations of leadership, strategy, and human behavior. The streets of Greenwich Village, where Vincent Gigante had spent decades moving invisibly in plain sight, had changed little over the years. Neon signs flickered in the evenings, the hum of traffic coursed along avenues, and the occasional murmur of pedestrians punctuated the calm night. To anyone glancing out of their apartment window, the world appeared ordinary. But for those who had known, even vaguely, who Vincent Gigante truly was, the quiet streets held a layered complexity that went unnoticed by the casual observer. He had been the Don who hid in plain sight, a man whose influence extended far beyond the visible, and whose life was a study in contrasts, power and invisibility, performance and reality, patience and inevitability. To understand the culmination of his life, one must first return to the early lessons that shaped him. Born in the Bronx during the late 1920s, Vincent Gigante grew up in a neighborhood of tight-knit immigrant families, where survival depended on observation, discretion, and adaptability. From a young age, he learned that patience and silence were as critical as physical strength. The streets were an education in the subtle rules of power. How one carried oneself, how one spoke or refrained from speaking, and how one assessed threats quietly determined not just survival, but opportunity. Gigante absorbed these lessons with remarkable precision, his mind cataloging behavior, alliances, and weaknesses, setting the foundation for a life that would later navigate the highest levels of organized crime without ever seeking overt recognition. His adolescence introduced him to the duality of strength, physical and psychological. Boxing taught him endurance, the control of pain, and the strategic use of force. Street fights, minor acts of violence, and the constant negotiation of respect honed his awareness. These early experiences instilled in him the understanding that force alone was insufficient, the most effective power lay in patience, timing, and the careful orchestration of perception. He learned that visibility could be dangerous, that every action had consequences far beyond the immediate, and that the appearance of weakness could be a powerful tool when wielded deliberately. By the time he entered the orbit of the Genovese crime family, these traits had matured. The family itself operated on principles that mirrored his instincts, discretion, patience, and hierarchical insulation. Front bosses absorbed attention while the true decision-makers remained hidden. Communication flowed indirectly through layers of intermediaries. Orders were delivered without direct attribution. Gigante thrived in this system, rising quietly yet steadily through its ranks, his influence growing without ever needing a public declaration. The combination of his natural temperament and the family's philosophy created a synergy that would define his life. He became a master of invisible control. The defining characteristic of his leadership, however, extended beyond organizational acumen. It was psychological. By the late 1970s and 1980s, Vincent Gigante perfected the act that would become legendary: feigned mental illness. Publicly, he wandered streets in bathrobes, muttering to himself, appearing disoriented and harmless. He allowed this persona to become consistent and normalized. Psychiatrists, judges, law enforcement officers, and neighbors all accepted the narrative. It was brilliant in its simplicity and relentless in its execution. To be underestimated is to be untouchable, and Gigante exploited this principle with surgical precision. He understood that influence is as much about perception as it is about action. The public absurdity of the wandering man concealed a web of control that spanned unions, gambling operations, construction, and illicit financial networks. Yet even as he performed this persona flawlessly, his influence within the Genovese family expanded. Decisions traveled through intermediaries, disputes were resolved quietly, operations continued without visible leadership. He did not issue orders directly but calibrated outcomes by subtle interventions, selecting intermediaries who were reliable, disciplined, and loyal. His leadership was not ostentatious, it was invisible yet effective, precise yet imperceptible. The paradox of his power lay in its quietness: the less one saw, the more one was controlled. Law enforcement, by contrast, was slow to adapt. For decades, prosecutors and agents were confounded by the gap between the man they observed and the empire they suspected existed. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants produced fragments of information, but these fragments lacked cohesion. Even when evidence pointed toward him, his carefully cultivated persona created doubt. The act of feigned insanity became a legal shield, delaying prosecution and frustrating authorities. Gigante had transformed invisibility into a systemic advantage, manipulating both human psychology and institutional procedures to protect himself. Despite the brilliance of his strategy, the law eventually began to close in. Advances in surveillance, the use of RICO statutes, and patient accumulation of evidence created a scenario in which even Gigante's meticulous defenses faced exposure. Prosecutors meticulously pieced together testimony, financial records, and patterns of influence that connected him to the family's operations. The illusion of incompetence, once nearly impenetrable, began to show cracks under sustained legal scrutiny. Court-ordered evaluations, witness testimony, and the interpretation of indirect communications gradually eroded the protective myth he had spent decades cultivating. The collapse of this illusion was methodical, reflecting the same careful strategy that had defined his life. There was no sudden, dramatic reveal. Instead, over time, the convergence of evidence, expert testimony, and legal interpretation dismantled the narrative. Gigante's feigned incapacity could no longer withstand the accumulation of proof against him. When he was finally convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, it was not amid chaos or spectacle but in quiet judicial resolution, a fitting end to a life defined by subtlety, patience, and invisible power. Even in prison, Gigante's influence did not vanish entirely. His reputation, cultivated over decades, carried weight. Associates outside continued to operate within the structures he had established, and the systems he built endured. Discipline, compartmentalization, and indirect control, the hallmarks of his leadership, allowed the Genovese family to function with remarkable continuity despite his confinement. Gigante's life demonstrated that authority need not be visible to be real, that structures could maintain control independent of physical presence, and that psychological mastery could be as potent as overt action. Reflecting on his legacy, the lessons of Gigante's life emerge clearly. He demonstrated that power is most sustainable when it is measured, patient, and strategic. Leadership is not solely about visibility or aggression, it can be exercised through discipline, control of perception, and careful orchestration of human behavior. He showed that invisibility can be a shield, that restraint can be a weapon, and that longevity depends on understanding not just systems, but human psychology. Where other bosses relied on intimidation and spectacle, Gigante relied on patience, discretion, and the careful management of perception. The cultural impact of his life is equally notable. Tales of the wandering man in a bathrobe became legendary, blending myth and reality, underscoring the extraordinary contrast between appearance and influence. Popular imagination framed him as eccentric, harmless, or even pitiable, yet beneath that surface lay a mind operating with extraordinary discipline and foresight. He became emblematic of the idea that true mastery often goes unnoticed, that the most formidable forces can operate quietly, and that appearances are not always trustworthy indicators of reality. Moreover, Gigante's life had a profound effect on law enforcement strategy. His methods forced prosecutors, investigators, and legal systems to develop new approaches to complex organized crime. They had to consider indirect influence, the manipulation of perception, and the long-term patterns of behavior rather than relying on immediate, observable actions. In this sense, his legacy extends beyond the underworld, influencing how authorities understand leadership, strategy, and deception in high-stakes environments. In contemplating the arc of Vincent Gigante's life, one observes a series of contrasts that define both the man and his impact. He was powerful yet invisible, disciplined yet patient, strategic yet understated. He commanded loyalty without assertion, exercised influence without visibility, and maintained control through systems rather than spectacle. These contrasts illuminate why his story remains a study in the art of power, the subtlety of influence, and the long-term management of both human behavior and perception. As the city continued its rhythms around him, the streets that had witnessed his decades-long performance seemed unchanged, yet they bore the imprint of his presence. The systems he built persisted, the stories of his persona endured, and the principles of his leadership, restraint, discretion, patience, and strategic invisibility, remained instructive. Vincent Gigante's life demonstrates that influence is not always measured by visibility or force, but by the ability to orchestrate outcomes quietly, to manipulate perception thoughtfully, and to endure patiently while shaping the world in profound ways. In the end, the image of the man in the bathrobe, wandering the streets of New York, continues to symbolize the paradox at the heart of his existence. A figure who appeared harmless and lost, yet whose impact reached far beyond what most could see or imagine. He was a master of invisibility, a strategist of human behavior, and an architect of systems that allowed him to maintain influence long after his physical presence could be measured. His story is not one of spectacle or flamboyance, but of quiet calculation, enduring patience, and a profound understanding of the subtle forces that govern both criminal enterprises and human perception. It is a testament to the idea that the greatest power is often exercised not through visibility, but through the patient, deliberate, and strategic shaping of the world from the shadows, leaving a legacy that endures far beyond the man himself. Vincent Gigante's life teaches that influence, mastery, and authority do not require recognition. They require patience, discipline, and the subtle manipulation of perception. The streets may forget the figure wandering in a bathrobe, but the systems, the principles, and the legacy remain, a quiet reminder that the most enduring power is often the power no one sees coming. The city slept around him, unaware that it had long been shaped, guided, and controlled by a man who hid in plain sight, and whose story would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary exercises of invisible authority in the history of organized crime.